Sticking around for my presentation here. Coach wanted our topic to be basketball specific, obviously, in the competitive season for the basketball player and all things in regard to strength and conditioning. I've been a strength and conditioning coach now for 20 years, and I really had a perspective change in 2018. Prior to that, I'll get into that in a moment, but prior to that, my experience, kind of my unofficial, if you will, internship was with Canada Basketball, as I mentioned earlier, with Coach Chang. I worked with the cadet team, and then I was fortunate to work with the senior national team for a number of training camps throughout a few summers. So really a big mentor of mine there was Dr. Charlie Weingroff, the head strength conditioning coach with Canada Basketball. Dr. Weingroff worked 3 seasons with the Philadelphia 76ers during the time when Allen Iverson was there. So I want to speak on that just quickly because I think most of us probably here know the best basketball players are not necessarily the best athletes in the weight room. So with that being said, how much of that stuff is really important varies. For sure, we're going to enhance some level of performance. Most importantly, I think we need to try to mitigate injury as much as possible. So with Dr. Weingroff and my time with him, he referred me to take a number of courses, and again, 2018, where I was mentioning, I had a bit of a perspective change on all things training, in that a great quote from one of the practitioners within a system here that I'm going to explain in a minute is novice trainers or novice strength and conditioning coaches are basically going to be choosing from a list of exercises to provide for their athletes. And really, I think an elite coach is going to be using principles of strength to determine then what they might be prescribing to their athletes. Does that make sense? So again, rather than just picking randomly a bunch of exercises that we may deem good exercises for an athlete, subjective. And why I want to speak on that is because the functional range systems, Dr. Andrea Spina, who's actually just from Milton, Ontario, and he's a founder, again, of the functional range systems that's very world-renowned. He spoke at the NBA Combine this summer. A big part of what I'm going to get into here with you guys is a big piece that I think is missing in most strength conditioning programs today. And again, it goes back to that injury mitigation. So we'll discuss that. But the first course you would have to take as a kind of prerequisite to blend out into the other courses for anyone that's a coach like myself or a practitioner, maybe a chiro, physio, any type of therapist, is we would all have to do what's called the functional range conditioning course. Okay, I'll get back to that in a moment. From there, where I went in my direction, because again, once you get that prerequisite course, you can blend out to any other courses thereafter. Is the functional range assessment. And what's great about the functional range assessment, I'll speak on, is it really opened my eyes to how biased our decision making can be. So has anyone ever seen or done this test before? Okay, question. What line is longer? The top or the bottom? What do you think? Why do you think they're equal? Did anybody think that they were not equal? Bear with my chicken scratch writing here too, guys, but did anybody, honestly, it's okay, guys, if you thought that maybe one of them was longer than the other, but they are equal. And I bet even for you guys that decided, yeah, they are equal, at first, what did you think? What was your first instinct when you saw it? Okay, so most people will gravitate towards that answer at first. So what this makes up here, what I'm speaking on, is cognitive behavior, and it's simply called System 1 and System 2 decision making. Okay, so it's what they call it in the evidence, System 1 versus System 2. So System 1's your very non-irrational, quick decision making, which you probably gravitated towards thinking that maybe the bottom was longer at first. A System 2 would be more critical thinking. I'm actually thinking about this. Maybe you would go as far as actually measuring to see which line is longer. Okay? So why I'm speaking on this is because it's important, guys. We fall biased into traps like this all the time with our decision making, all the time. So if you're going to go work with a strength and conditioning coach that's maybe a former power lifter, they're going to like to do barbell exercises. Guess what you're probably going to be doing with that type of trainer? Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but again, like, is that necessarily what the athlete needs? Okay? So, like myself, guys, I love the sport of basketball. I still play at a pretty decent level at the age of 44, just playing against some of my players that I'm fortunate to work with. And for me, obviously at my age, it's about, and it should be for anyone at any age, I would think, if you do indeed love the sport and you want to continue on, is we have to try to preserve our tissue to be able to mitigate these sport-related injuries so that we can stretch out our career a little longer, right? What's the inevitable that's going to happen with any athlete? Their body can't keep up with the demands of the sport anymore. They're then going to be forced to retire, right? Maybe a catastrophic injury contributes to that. All right, so again, I see this. I've invested in a lot of other coaches' programs to just trial and error through myself before I give to any of my athletes. I've taken countless certifications before. They're all the same thing. They're all the same stuff, just repackaged. Just biased decision making against whatever exercise selection that coach thinks is going to be the best for you guys. Okay, so that brings us back to the functional range assessment. What we would do as practitioners in the functional range systems is we would go through an assessment that would be pretty detailed with every single part of your body, checking every joint and the articulations as to how they move. And I want to give you guys some examples as to that. And then for sure we can have context here as to why that would matter in the game of sport, okay? Because again, I just think these programs today, they're all gas and no brakes. What I mean by that is everything is performance driven. And guys, they're saying this, right? They're saying today there's more catastrophic injuries happening in the sport of basketball at an alarming rate than ever before. Just roundtable discussion. Why is that? Why do we think that is? Any guess? There's definitely a substantial more amount of basketball being played probably than the past.
Yeah, everyone's kind of just like they'll spend most of their time on the court, like not enough strength.
Yep. 100%. Guys, again, I love the game, man. All your time, not all your time, but I should say most of your time and energy is going to be and should be funneled into becoming a better basketball player if indeed that's what your goal is, right? So now the question becomes, how much strength and conditioning do I need to manage and train on top of that? Because I believe there's a substantial amount of volume, right? Like you guys have seen these programs before. Like it's a laundry list of exercises. It always seems to be some weird thing, like you got to do 3 sets, various rep ranges. It's a lot, right? And it's challenging to manage. So again, today I want to help you guys manage that a little bit better. And again, what I referred to again by this all gas, no brakes, is just that. All of the training is being funneled into performance-driven outcomes, and very little of it is injury mitigation. Why I use the word mitigation rather than prevention or reduction is because all that's BS. Like you can't prevent an ankle sprain if you're going to land on someone's foot and your ankle inverts, right? It's just going to happen. It's like an oh shit moment, right? You can't prevent that. It doesn't matter what you do. The more you play the game, the more you're going to become injured at a certain time. Hands up, we just use a simple example of a very common injury in basketball. Who's had an ankle sprain here? And guess what, guys? The likelihood of you having it happen again is very high. You want to know how high? The evidence says about 3 to 4 times more likelier after you've already sustained that traumatic injury. Okay? So I'll come back to that in a moment because again, I'm going to help us see maybe from a better lens as to how we can mitigate those future problems. Automatically, when someone comes in and they assess with me before I even run the FRA, I want to know their injury history, and then I want to know what they did after that injury. So just guys, again, there's no right or wrong, man, but when you had the ankle injury and you sprained your ankle, what did you do?
Iced it.
Mm-hmm.
And dipped it in hot water after.
What's really cool is the evidence has changed because we used to think ice was the thing, right? I just went and saw my family doctor this week for a little hip thing I got going on, and she told me to ice it. I'm like, well, I'll get into that, okay? So the acronym has changed. If you're interested, the old acronym RICE, because that's what she told me to do too, do the RICE acronym, rest, ice, compress, elevate. That no longer exists. It's now peace and love. So you can Google up the acronym after. Peace and love is the acronym for post-injury. And okay, so again, they come in, they have an injury history. What do they do, say, after the ankle injury? That's very important to me because we want to start loading it appropriately. Obviously, the load is not going to be that high upon an injury. The most important thing here to look at, though, in something simple like an ankle sprain, and did you guys see KD when he went up in the layup line to try to dunk and he put that foot down and it just rolled like that, like non-contact injury? How long ago did that happen? That was weeks ago now, right? Has he played yet? Hasn't played yet, so I will bet, I don't know for sure what's going on in their training program. I know the Phoenix Suns strength coach pretty well. I've had dialogue with him over the years, but KD just went to the Suns, so I know Corey Schlesinger hasn't done any work with him yet. But I can bet that KD did not ever put his ankle in this position and train it in that position. And that's why it was a no shit moment, right? When he rolled his ankle, the tissue yielded. It tore because he doesn't ever go there. So it's a great quote by the founder of this system I'm going to speak on. Dr. Spina's quote is, "You're always going to regret getting hurt in the position you never trained in." Which makes sense. Okay? So if I know I'm working with a group of basketball players, Aaron, Noah, all fall, what did we do? We would put our ankle as a team in this setup and we would isometrically load it. You guys are familiar with isometrics? I would just tell guys, give me whatever intensity. We would progressively load over time, push into the floor like you're pushing the floor away. By putting that ankle in that stretched position, all that lateral connective tissue of the lateral side of my ankle would be stimulated the more you push into the floor. Okay? Now, is it to say that when your ankle rolls, I'm bulletproofing your ankle and nothing bad's going to happen? Of course not, but maybe it won't be as bad. Does that make sense? Okay? So again, if I know I'm working with a group of basketball players, I know these injuries are the most common injuries, then I'm going to invest time training that stuff because, again, you guys are telling me all that you want to play post-secondary, you want to maybe play pro one day. Well, you can't do that if you're sitting on the bench or if you're dealing with injuries that are just, consuming you. Okay? What's another common injury in basketball? Knees. ACL ruptures. So we'll get into that, guys. We'll get into all this, but just using that ankle example, you can kind of see where I'm going with it. Okay? So the functional range assessment, we'll look at all of the joints. I'm going to obviously take us through a modified one today. We're not going to go through it all. And then I'll explain these principles of strength because, again, I love my guy Dewey's quote in regard to an elite trainer is going to go off of principles of strength rather than just picking and choosing a bunch of exercises, throwing them on the wall and hoping they stick, so to speak, right? So the principles of strength, we're going to work the deepest tissue before the superficial tissue. What does that mean? Guys, when you were in your mom's fetus, you weren't even developed yet, obviously. But what was predetermined for you was the capsular space of your joints. So what does that mean? It means you're a glob or a blob of cells in your mom's fetus, but your space of where your joints lie were already there predetermined for you. When you were born, you all had joints that could move. Over time, we start to lose that, not because we age, but another great quote I'm going to steal from Dr. Spina, is as you age, you don't lose it. If you lose it if you don't use it. There we go. So if we're not expressing the way our joints are meant to move in their greatest capacities, over time you lose them. It's not because you get older. There's like 80-year-old women out there that can still do the splits because they're dance instructors that do it every day, right? So that's why they can still do it. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's good then that we know that. So how do we preserve that as we age? I'm going to take us through that today. Okay, so deep tissue before superficial tissue. Also, in your joints, your joint tissue, we have what are called mechanoreceptors. Mechanoreceptors are the receptors that send signals to your brain based off of how you're moving through your environment, right? So how your brain sees you move in 3D space is through these mechanoreceptors. So you best believe I want to stimulate those receptors to be able to get the most out of our movement. Does that make sense? Okay, so again, deep tissue would mean more that deep joint, connective tissue. I'll speak on the difference between connective tissue and muscle tissue in a moment. But deep tissue first before I blend out into more muscular-based tissue. Okay, so that would mean prior to our muscular-based training, I'm going to stimulate more of that capsular tissue. I'll show you again how we'll do that today. All our joints' fundamental motion is rotation, except for the spine. I'll get to that last. It just flips, okay? So spine is linear, meaning fundamentally I have to be able to flex and extend my spine before I'm going to be able to effectively rotate it, okay? And then vice versa for every other joint, we have to be able to rotate first. Again, going back to most exercises that we see, they involve very little rotation. They're very sagittal plane motions. What sagittal plane means is it's very front to back or up and down. Okay, but do we just move like robots, guys, when we play basketball? No, we rotate, right? So it's like why we square peg and round holes by squat, deadlifting, bench pressing, doing these sagittal plane motions all the time. Okay, something else to think about. Deep tissue. We want to be tissue specific before pattern specific. So what that means, again, let's say Jamar comes to see me, he's telling me about his history, he's got an ankle problem, his ankle hurts when he's playing. Okay, how many years ago did you sprain your ankle? He says a couple years ago and I'm still dealing with this pain. What'd you do after it? Okay, you didn't really do too much for it. Then that's going to kind of give me an indication that that's the primary motive of his training program. I don't care about squats, because he doesn't have an ankle that's even helping him be pain-free playing basketball. So who gives a care about squat? All right, so that's what I mean by like tissue specific. I'm going to be very geared towards training the tissue of his ankle primarily before I go pattern specific like an exercise like the squat pattern. Make sense? Isolated before integrated. Even though, that's another good example. Guys, do you need a set of good moving, flowing ankles to be able to do something like a deep squat? You don't? You don't need ankles to squat or to get low? Of course you do, right? That's very important. So, people think too that strength is just this general concept. Like if I do squats, I'm going to get strong. But I'm going to take you through different inputs and what different types of strength that you might be training for. And the squat's not going to get you strong, it's just going to get you strong at the squat, basically, right? So is that important for you? Is your sport squatting? No, you're not a power lifter, right? You're a basketball player. Okay, and then, so fast versus slow loading, that varies depending on what we're training. I'll get more into that when we get into our inputs and some examples. Obviously, weaknesses versus strengths doesn't mean I don't want to sharpen the sword at what you're already good at. That's performance training, make you do what you're already good at and enhance that. But certainly, again, Jamar's case for an example, if it's an ankle issue, that's kind of what I want to gear towards, funnel more of our training towards, okay? And 24-hour window, I'll get more into that in a moment, but guys, every day you wake up and you're alive, you have an opportunity to work on the things I'm about to take you through, okay? Does anybody think here that they have hips that need work and they want to demonstrate some hips? Aaron, come lay on the table, buddy.
I literally broke my hip. I'm perfect, huh?
Right on your back. I heard the word chiropractor. I just want you to know, Dr. Spina, I've learned this system from him and his staff of chiropractors. And I'm seeing a chiropractor for my hip right now. And I just want to throw this out there, guys. Like chiropractors, all chiropractors are not just snap, crackle, pop, get you out of the office. I have not had one adjustment from any of the chiropractors I've seen. I'm not saying it's not necessary when needed, but we do know some of those therapists that they just have you in for a few minutes, crack you, throw an ice pack on, and send you home. That's why I'm here, guys, is I don't stand for that stuff, okay? So I want to give the best when the best is needed. So, again, fundamental motion of all your joints except for the spine is what? Rotation. So I'm going to look at rotation first. So hip internal rotation, and the tissue responsible for internally rotating your hip is the deepest tissue of the hip. So I want to work that first, because remember, that's one of the principles. Deep before superficial, right? So with internal rotation, what the evidence suggests that you need for internal rotation, and I'm rotating Aaron's hip, and if anyone's confused why I'm going out and it's called internal rotation, you guys know the way the end of a bone looks, almost like a little heart. It's internally rotating inside the acetabulum of his hip, his femur that is, as I bring him out. That's why it's called internal rotation, okay? Everyone kind of gets confused that. The other thing I'm going to be watching for here as an assessment is he's not compensating. Because guys, that's what we do. If you can't move very well in a given area, you're going to have to make up for the movement somewhere. So you're going to just compensate through other areas. It's usually the neighboring areas, the above or below joint. So in this case, I'm watching for Aaron's pelvis on this side not to hike up the more I bring him out into internal rotation. Okay, again, the evidence suggests about 35, maybe 40 degrees of internal rotation. And you can see Aaron's got about 15. If I'm a nice guy, I'd give him 20. And he's kind of squinting and making a face here, so I know this isn't too pleasant for him. So how would I get this back? I'll go through that in a moment. But the second thing I want to do is, one, check as a functional range assessment, how much passive range of motion does he have? That means how much can he get into when I take him there, versus how much active range he has. So now I want you to rotate out just the same way I did for you. And I'm going to let go and go back and forth. You can go inside and out. Yep. So that's external rotation. I would look at that next, but we're looking at his internal rotation. Again, I'm watching for no compensation here. Keep that leg right up there, tabletop with the floor. Okay, now guys, why does this matter? Why does any of this even matter? Well, I like to give examples of really shifty, really good ball handlers. Name one. Kyrie. I knew you guys would name Kyrie. But if you look at Kyrie's angles, when he's doing his crossovers, an immense amount of hip internal rotation. Okay, you can't move where you can't move. That's another great quote I love by Dr. Spina. So Aaron's hip cannot move there because I can't move him any more than where I moved him, right? So what if he needed that on the court? He's our starting point guard with our juvenile team. If he wants to be shiftier, I'd like you to play a little better defense too. But you can see, guys, no, but for real though, for real, you can see fundamentally you have to be able to move in these positions first to be able to do that. So what's crazy as coaches is we just scream and yell at players, get lower. What if they don't have those ankles to get lower? Get your chest up, get lower. And the kid's just like, oh my God, I'm confused. What do I do? Fundamentally, they may not be able to get there, okay? So that's why we would run this assessment. Okay, any questions about that? So he has yay amount of passive range of motion. Again, I'm not happy with that, so I would want to gain, what's the kind of buzzword that we hear? Mobility, right? We need more mobility there. We call it workspace. We need more workspace in his joint for him to move there. Because you see this, guys, you guys see this all the time, right? We're doing mobility exercises. We're just flowing through. That's not mobility, that's ability. That's what you can move into based off of where your joints currently can move. So that's not mobility training. If I needed to expand more workspace in Aaron's joint, can you slide down a little more to the edge of the table? I would do this hands-on with him first, and then because I don't want him to like come and see me all the time, I want him to be able to do this on his own, then I would show him different setups. I would rig him up into this position, and then I would execute an input one, because we don't call these things exercises, because we're not biasing exercises. I'm trying to get more hip internal rotation. So we call that an input one, where we're looking to expand more space in his hip. Obviously, I would check the other side. Guys, there's so many more that I would look at based off of the shoulder and the hip move identically the same because they're both ball and socket joints. Let me show you on this side. So for internal rotation of the shoulder, which is the same thing I just checked for his hip, I would bring him into internal rotation. Lots of passive range of motion there. Go ahead and move yourself into it, Aaron. He's got the active range. Neighboring joints will want to compensate. Usually that scap and shoulder will hike up, so boom, okay? So the thing now, good job, Aaron, come on up, you're done. After I go through every part of his body, I then need to, because guys, sometimes like I do this, right? Like there's gonna be more than one thing that might need to be worked on. But where do we want to funnel the time and energy into what's most important for right now, right? As I mentioned for Aaron, I haven't even looked at other parts of you yet, and I don't want to be biased, and I don't want to use a system 1 approach. I want to be system 2 in my thinking, and that I want to make sound decisions. I would assess the entire body first and then decide, okay, what is it that we need right now, okay? We don't want to make the mistake of training too many parts, because there is a certain amount of frequency that you're going to need. Okay, now lastly, before I move on from speaking about an input 1, creating more workspace or more mobility, here's the cool thing about it. How much intensity does it require for him to expand his hip? You want to know? A lot. So I would rig him up right here. I'll show you guys an example of how to do it on your own. Some of you guys have probably seen this or done this before. I might just use the floor. Instead of me as a practitioner there, here you go, Aaron, at home. You would bring yourself into passive range of motion. Don't want you to compensate in there, so use your hip, not your spine. And then from here, I would teach him how to do some practice reps, right? We do some pails here, some isometrics. And then from there, I would get him to drive with as much force as he can, pushing into the floor. And then I would ask him to then try to drive and rotate so his hip internally rotates more as if his foot was coming off the floor. It's not going to come off the floor, obviously, because he's in his end range. Millimeters of more space is going to be created in the hip after that, or in any other joint for that matter. Okay? How many sessions, how much frequency of him having to do that would be necessary? It varies on the human, right? I work with pro athletes. They've been running up and down the court for a long time. Let me just speak on that too quickly, guys. Do you think playing your sport is going to make your tissue and your joints healthier? Or do you think over time you're going to lose some of that healthiness? The answer, yeah, because this is not normal human behavior, right? Like running up and down an invented hardwood floor, wearing invented shoes and socks is not normal human behavior. So obviously that comes with a cost. And that cost is your tissue health. So how you want to manage that is up to you, okay? So I'm going to help you out with that. Okay, the next input, can we go back to ankle for a second? Because this is what I was saying. Within that ankle inversion sprain, guys, what did we talk about? What are we doing right after? Resting it, icing it. So are you guys familiar with scar tissue? You guys familiar with scar tissue? As soon as you have an injury, your nervous system starts to immediately put scar tissue into that area. Now here's the thing about scar tissue. It's not very good quality tissue, okay? It's very much like, I'll reference it to like a mesh. So there's holes in it, right? Which means there's give. It's not as dense as the tissue was previously, or healthier, more robust tissue. So because there's those holes in it and it's not as dense, because it's just patchwork, right? It's just your nervous system's way of quickly putting tissue down there so that you could get back to what you're doing. But that's just temporary. That's not going to last, because the evidence says when you sustain an injury, you're 3 to 4 times likelier to get re-injured. Why is that? Because you didn't do the work to create more collagen 1 fiber, because that's the difference between healthy tissue and scar tissue. Scar tissue is more collagen 3 rich fiber versus collagen 1 fiber that's more healthier and robust. How do you start? This is now what we're talking about with an input 2. How do you start putting healthy tissue, which we call connective tissue architecture? They use the term architecture in the evidence because it's like a foundation of a house or a building, right? It's what you're you guys know what connective tissue is, right? I told you earlier, it's the tissue in your joint capsules, it's your tendons, and it's your ligaments. It's white in color, guys, versus your muscle tissue, which is more red in color. Make sense? Okay. Where's all the training being funneled into today? Very much muscular-based training or nervous system-based training. When you do things really heavy and strong, or when you do things very explosive, that's more neurological-based training versus muscular. There's zero connective tissue training being trained in most programs today. That's the stuff that gets injured. So what are we doing for it? Again, that's why I'm here. Okay, so if I wanted to increase connective tissue architecture in an ankle, this is the cool thing about it. It doesn't take much intensity like it does for expanding more workspace, as I mentioned and showed you down here, to expand more in Aaron's hip if he needed that. It doesn't take much intensity. So guys, day one, I remember this was a couple summers ago, I rolled my ankle, I went home, I put it in this position, maybe it wasn't that far, because I, was obviously banged up. I put it in this position. I am lightly doing those isometrics. A light effort is enough to send the signal to my brain to start putting more collagen 1 rich fibers into that area. And now that connective tissue that looked like a mesh is starting to fill in. Does that make sense? Okay? How often now you do that is really important, because when you train muscles, or when you train your brain at a high intensity doing something more neurological based, like say a 1 rep max, say squat or deadlift, it's required to take 48 to 72 hours of recovery. Connective tissue, a few hours. So I sprain my ankle. I start doing a like 5 to 10% of my best effort, as if I'm pushing into the floor to move my ankle that way. And I time that maybe about 15, 20 seconds to start. Go about my day. A few hours later, do it again. Do it again. I do it again. Who's doing that though? You know what I mean? Like that's the thing. It's just like, I'm going to give you guys the sauce right now and the secrets as to how to do this, but it's up to you to want to do that, right? Any questions about that though? That could apply to anything, yeah?
So it depends, of course, I think on the level of the sprain. Like sometimes kids have a sprain, they need like a couple of days rest. Sometimes the swelling becomes really big.
Yeah.
So in case of like a big swelling, do we still do these?
Yeah, because first off, what is the swelling? It's your nervous system's way of compressing, protecting the joint. That's why it swells up. Then we do a weird thing where we try to undo that natural innate thing of swelling up by putting ice on it to reduce the swelling. Do you see how? Yeah, do you see how the evidence has changed now from that? It's no longer put ice on it. It's load. Peace and love, the L in love, load. So you're starting to load it now, safely. Again, not 5 to 10% is not going to be where I want you to end up. That's just where we start. Sorry?
Even through pain, even if it's hurting, you keep doing
A lot of therapists seem to have this like no more than a 3 or a 4 out of 10 in pain.
Okay.
You have to, there's a little pain that's going to be there, right? It's just a part of it because the tissue yield, it's obviously going to be under stress. Does that answer your question? So yeah, it swells up. It's okay. Now, obviously, guys, what is the extreme? Let's assume we've ruled out that there's a fracture. Nothing's broken. You got imaged. Then proceed. Yeah. Okay. All right. So the last one I want to speak of that is in terms of connective tissue, because if we don't have time to get into the muscle-based stuff, that's fine. We do see, I don't know if it's optimally trained, but it is suboptimally trained in most training programs. I can come back to that in a moment. An increase in connective tissue load-bearing capacity. So, a low intensity, longer duration, more frequent bouts to give us an input two of building connective tissue architecture. But now I want so much load-bearing capacity in that ankle that when that does happen again, it's not an oh shit moment like it would have been prior, or if you hadn't trained it. Okay? So again, now that just brings us back to here, and now obviously over time, because we've progressively loaded, we're out of pain, I'm progressively increasing the intensity as to how much I push. Guys, it's a scale. The higher the intensity is, the lower the duration's gonna be. Vice versa. Does that make sense? You guys understand what I mean by that? Any questions about that? Okay.
And does these also reduce inflammation or?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, because again, what is inflammation, right? It's just tissue that's not healthy, right? So how do we keep it healthy? One, just guys, because I'm showing you versions of isometrics. How do you keep your tissue healthy? You move it. So do this with me, guys. Put your leg out in front, this is the anatomy of how your ankle moves. Okay, it pulls back into dorsiflexion. I'm going to give you the anatomical terms. It rolls out and in and on an angle into inversion, that's eversion, sorry. And then you plantar flex by pointing it, and then you invert it. And then if you're doing this, what we call controlled articular rotation, by moving it through its greatest range of motion in a nice, slow, controlled manner, you're hitting all of the function of how your ankle moves. Okay, so the boys know I do CARs with them. We call them, again, controlled articular rotations. For Aaron's hip, because we only looked at internal rotation. So if I wanted Aaron now, after the training I gave him, to expand workspace, or prior to going into expanding his mobility of his hip, I might warm him up with what we call, again, CARs, because here is the 6 functions of how your hip moves. And by doing your controlled articular rotations, we're not biasing an exercise. Again, you do a squat, you're hip flexing and you're hip extending your hips. There's a little bit of external rotation and abduction if you drive your knees out, but it's not enough is what I'm saying. Like, it just doesn't cover the entire function of your anatomy. So remember, if you don't use it, you lose it. So now Aaron has a new hip, say, because I gave him a high intensity bout of expanding his workspace, input 1, and now when he goes to do something like his hip car, or even those little hip axial rotations that he did, right? He's got a more range of motion now. He has a new hip. So when you go and continue to move it after, you're just backfilling your nervous system by allowing you to keep that over time. It's just called afferent efferent feedback. I guarantee you guys have all heard this before. The mind-muscle connection. Yes? It's actually more like the mind connective tissue connection. Why? Because again, those mechanoreceptors deep in your joint, they're the first things that are having a conversation with your nervous system. Your brain then sends the signal back to those mechanoreceptors so you move, okay? So, any other questions about these first 3 inputs? Because this is the stuff we're not seeing in training programs today. I purposely did this black versus red because that's connective tissue inputs, okay? All right, so in terms of muscle-based training, well, we have 4 ways we would train muscle. Again, when I don't know if this is being optimally trained. Do you guys have any experience with strength and conditioning? Josh, these are some of your guys? I want to say too, with Josh and Alan, who are both basketball coaches and strength coaches, I freaking love that because I'm the same. I feel like we need more of these guys that are hybrids that can bridge the gap. There's such a disconnect, I find, between basketball coaches and strength coaches at every level. I'm not just talking grassroots, okay? So muscular-based inputs, guys. Fast twitch, you guys are familiar with this, right? You guys know, like turkey meat? Like the turkey meat has a combination of brown and white meat, yes? The brown meat is more the fast twitch, and the white meat is more the slow twitch muscle. We're comprised of the same thing, okay? Combination of both. So fast twitch muscle not to failure, I'll explain how that would be, versus slow twitch not to failure, or do I want to go fast twitch or slow twitch to failure? Josh, who's got some like experience training here with you? I'm talking like a good 2 years maybe. No, okay, so then you guys are all pretty novice to strength and conditioning. Maybe if I'm being nice, we're being nice, intermediate, yeah? Do I need to, if I need to build muscle with someone who's novice, do I need to have them do a set to failure? No, getting close to failure, it's fatigue. We often say keep 2 to 3 reps maybe in the tank. That'll be enough to send the signal to your brain to lay muscle down. But guys, when you're an experienced athlete and you're trying to lay more muscle down somewhere, this is what bodybuilders do, right? They train the set to failure. And they're done. That sends the signal to the brain to lay more muscle tissue down, okay? That's for hypertrophy or hypertrophic purposes where you're trying to grow muscle. Why might I want these to train not to failure, though I gave you an example for a novice player? But fast twitch, you guys know what the difference between fast and slow twitch muscle is? Fast twitch muscle will recruit really fastly, but it will fatigue really quickly. So like when I measure my athletes and we do vertical jumps, for example, I don't have you guys do any more than a few jumps, right? Because usually kind of after, give or take with the athlete, after about 4 or 5 reps, the numbers get lower. They don't get higher, they get lower. You would need a good recovery, which they recommend a good few minutes is how long it takes to recharge your nervous system to come back and execute that again at the same numbers or maybe higher. Does that make sense? Okay? So hey, if your goal is to train to become more explosive, you don't want to do your sets to fatigue. Because now you're telling your brain to be able to do an explosive activity for more capacity, for more period or longer duration. It's not going to be the best output, but you're going to be doing it for long, which you need as a basketball player though, right? We need endurance components. Yep, almost done, good. So that would be a fast twitch not to failure example, okay? Slow twitch, not to failure. Well, that's again, what if I want to push out more capacity on something? I want you to be able to do something for a longer period of time because again, you do play sport. Guys, you know that your sport is a combination of power endurance sport. They compare basketball and soccer to both being power endurance sport. Basketball is tipping a little more to the power end of the spectrum. Soccer is a little more on the endurance end of the spectrum, but they're both power endurance sports. Okay? So you need to be able to display these things over a period of time. Any questions about the muscle inputs? So, how a program might look for Aaron's hip. Once I've invested some time expanding some workspace in his hip, and I'm happy with that, I would then maybe want, or the ankle, maybe someone can't bend their ankles very well, and I need them to get lower. Coach is always screaming at them to get lower. Once I've expanded workspace for their parts to move nicer, well, you bet we're going to want to backfill that with more connective tissue architecture and load bearing capacity, because once you open space up, the tissue that you can now move into, it sucks. You haven't trained it before because you've never been there before, right? So you have to build that tissue up. And then again, I would probably bias more slow twitch training, more for work capacity, before I would want to bump up the ability for it to discharge force really fast. Okay? Guys, I know that was a brief kind of rundown of how I would do things, but is there any questions?
When it comes to motivate, this is something I'm working on.
Yeah.
Some success, some failure. When it comes to motivating these young folks, on doing some of the stuff that's not incorporated enough. It's not sexy, right? Like,
Totally not. No.
So,
guys, it's not fun to do some of this stuff. It's not like, yeah.
Right? All the kids want to get hot.
100%.
They just do that, right? But how do you find success in motivating, especially in bigger groups?
I think that this is kind of like a no shit kind of answer, but it helps that we're basketball guys and that we can use basketball related scenarios to this and speak the language, so to speak. And it is what they need too, right? Like I have athletes that come to me that only work on this stuff. And we don't even work on what we call external training, which is picking exercises to train for performance purposes. And you know, with one of them that we work with together, who's Arda, I am doing the things that you might not be doing in your program just to help but backfill some of that connective tissue stuff. But I'm not stepping on toes and doing the stuff that you're already doing with him, because what's the point in doing that? He's already getting that, right? So it always comes down to what it is they need. I would say, also, I just want to go back quickly, guys. Last thing I'll say here about this is, what if, like I have an 11-year-old and I've ran him through all his parts move fine. So do I need to work on this stuff? Well, I don't need an input 1 with them, but if you're familiar, do you remember I told you it takes a high degree of intensity to get that? What's the highest intensity that you would do in a training environment? Like a 1 rep max, which we call absolute strength, right? And the more stronger you guys, I don't bias powerlifting because we're not powerlifters. You guys know, I'll put them in position specific, right? Like as if we're like trying to create like more of a lateral like motion, and we'll get against the wall, count down to 5, and they're pushing as hard as they can. And when you generate that much force and amplitude, you're stimulating more stuff. And when you do that after you warm up, kind of prior to your earlier part of your training session, and then you go do muscular inputs after, you get a better outcome, okay? So again, to answer your question, Josh, you just, as a practitioner, as a coach, it's all in wordplay, right? And people don't care how much you know unless they know how much you care. So once you build that relationship and rapport with them, now it's like, hey buddy, do you really care about this sport? Do you really want to play at the next level? Because you're not going to do that when you're sitting on the bench riddled with injuries, right? Lastly, how many, go ahead. Yeah.